20,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley on a January morning in 1944, the B-17 takes a flak burst through the waist. Metal shrieks. The number 3 turbo regulator seizes, starving the supercharger. Cabin pressure bleeds away. In the same instant, a jagged fragment shears the oxygen manifold behind the radio room bulkhead, and pure O2 hisses into sub-zero air. Staff Sergeant Harold Reichert, flight engineer, feels the shudder through the fuselage before the pilot calls it over interphone. He's already moving, no checklist for this. The training films at Amarillo showed turbo runaway drills and oxygen fire protocol, but never both failures at once, never while the aircraft bucks through a barrage and a swarm of Messerschmitt 109s peels in from 12 o'clock high. Reichert crouches beside the manifold, breath condensing in his mask. The line is crimped, leaking fast. In his tool roll, safety wire, speed tape, a spare compression sleeve scavenged 3 missions back from a wreck in East Anglia. The manual says, land immediately. The doctrine says, abort. The air miles from friendly coast say otherwise. He wraps wire in tight coils, fingers stiff inside wool gloves, and jams the sleeve over the tear. Tape follows, layer on layer, a patchwork seal that might hold or might ignite if a spark finds the residual oxygen. He doesn't have the luxury of certainty. Scarcity dictates the inventory. 1 sleeve, 1 chance. But his hands move with the abundance of 1,000 repetition hours wrenching engines in Kansas, then England, then over hostile Europe. The turbo control is worse. The regulator cable has jumped its pulley, and the number 3 engine screams, overboosting. Reichert snakes his arm into the crawl space behind the top turret mount, finds the cable, and reseats it by feel. The engine note drops. The pilot's voice crackles. Good, Rick. Stay sharp. No time to secure tools. The top turret is unmanned. The original gunner slumped against the fuselage, unconscious from hypoxia, before Reichert's fix restored flow. Reichert hauls himself into the seat, swings the twin 50s forward, and tracks the lead 109 as it grows in the glass. The fighter's wings sparkle. Cannon rounds crack past the nose. Reichert fires. The guns hammer. Tracers arc out, and the Messerschmitt breaks left, trailing smoke or fuel. The combat report will list it only as driven off, because mechanics don't get confirmed kills. And this mission doesn't end in certainty, only survival, stitched from wire and will. This is the story we're going to reconstruct, not the legend of the Flying Fortress as an invincible machine, but the ground truth of how one enlisted mechanic kept a wounded bomber aloft through a gauntlet of flak and fighters, what he did in sequence, why the improvised fixes held, and what it cost him and his crew. We'll walk through it step by step, using 8th Air Force unit diaries, wartime tech orders and training manuals filed at Maxwell, and the restoration archives that still preserve these oxygen lines and turbo systems in working form. Every repair, every gauge reading, every second of the fight can be traced back to the manual or the men who lived it. The contrast runs deeper than pliers and triggers. It's doctrine against improvisation under fire, the machine's engineered tolerances against the man who exceeded them. The scarcity of parts measured against the abundance of nerve required when both run out. And it begins, as these stories always do, with a choice made in seconds that will ripple across hours and across the razor-thin margin between a crew that comes home and one lost to the winter sky over Germany. The scene over the Ruhr will come later, in 1944, when the 8th Air Force flies from paved runways in England with supply depots that can on good weeks keep pace with combat attrition. But the culture of improvised survival, the fusion of wrench and gun, was forged 2 years earlier and 7,000 miles south in a theater where scarcity was doctrine, and every mission tested what a flying fortress could endure when stripped to its rivets. Early 1942, the Southwest Pacific, the 19th Bomb Group, first heavy bombardment unit to reach the theater, operates from a string of half-finished fields scattered across northern Australia and Papua New Guinea. Townsville, on the Queensland coast, is a sun-baked dispersal with dirt taxiways and canvas hangars baking metal too hot to touch. Port Moresby, across the Coral Sea, is worse, a malarial strip hacked from kunai grass, close enough to Rabaul that enemy bombers visit regularly, forcing ground crews to work at night when the moon is down. The missions themselves are punishing. Strikes against Rabaul, Leh, and the shipping lanes around New Guinea demand 8-hour round trips over open ocean, beyond the range of any friendly fighter. Navigation is dead reckoning over featureless water. Engine failures mean ditching in seas patrolled by enemy float planes, and the B-17s themselves, early D&E models rushed to the theater in the chaotic weeks after Pearl Harbor, arrive with systems already fatigued by the ferry flight across the Pacific, then begin to corrode the moment they touch tropical air. Salt spray pits aluminum skin, moisture creeps into electrical junctions, hydraulic seals crack in the humidity, and dust from the laterite strips clogs turbos and oil coolers. Parts arrive by cargo ship on schedules measured in weeks, if they arrive at all. Spare oxygen regulators, turbo wastegates, propeller governors, components designed to be swapped as complete assemblies in the maintenance philosophy written at Wright Field simply aren't there. So the ground crews adapt. They cannibalize. A B-17 that limps back with a shattered tail section is stripped so another aircraft can fly. Hangar queens become donors. Fuselages picked clean in a mechanical triage that Army Air Forces doctrine never anticipated, but necessity demanded. The most famous survivor of this process is the Swoos, a composite fortress whose tail section, documented in maintenance logs and still visible in the restoration at the National Museum of the Air Force, came from another aircraft entirely. She wore parts from at least 4 different airframes by the time she rotated stateside, a patchwork monument to scarcity's innovation. Into this gap between doctrine and reality stepped a small cadre of men whose job descriptions never quite captured what they actually did. The flight engineer in AAF nomenclature was an enlisted specialist, usually a staff sergeant, trained in power plant and systems management. Technical Order 1-20EG-1, the B-17 Flight Handbook, lists his duties: monitor manifold pressures, adjust fuel mixtures, transfer tanks, troubleshoot malfunctions, and coordinate with the pilot on engine-out procedures. He sits or stands in the cockpit between the pilot and co-pilot, eyes on the instrument panel, hands ready. But that was the stateside manual. In the Pacific, the flight engineer was also the crew chief, the man who signed off the Form 1A after pre-flight and who, more often than not, had personally rigged the repair that kept the aircraft flyable. He knew which oxygen line had been spliced with borrowed fittings, which turbo had a tendency to overboost above 18,000 feet, which circuit breaker would pop under sustained generator load. He carried that knowledge into the air because he had built it on the ground, sometimes with proper parts, more often with improvisation that would horrify a technical inspector but would hold together long enough to matter. And when the fighters came, and they always came on the long legs to Rabaul, he left the instrument panel and climbed into the top turret. Twin Browning 50s, 360 degrees of traverse, the highest position on the aircraft and the most exposed. Gunnery was not in the technical order for flight engineers, but crews were short-handed and the turret could not sit empty, so he flew as both mechanic and gunner, steward of the machine and defender of it, embodying in one man the tension between what the bomber was designed to be and what it had to become. This dual role, wrench in one hand, gun in the other, is the lens through which we'll follow the mission. The character at the center of this story is a composite, built from the ground crew diaries and mission reports of the 19th Bomb Group archived at Maxwell Air Force Base and cross-referenced with AAF training circulars and tech orders. Specific in-flight repair actions are drawn from multiple documented incidents, stitched together to show the range of what these men faced and solved in real time. The goal is not to invent a hero, but to reconstruct a role, and in doing so, to understand how doctrine bent under the weight of distance, scarcity, and survival. Because when the manual runs out, what remains is the man who wrote his own. 3 weeks after a belly landing at Port Moresby tore the aft fuselage and crumpled the tail assembly, the maintenance officer walks the flight line with a clipboard and stops beside the wreck. B-17E, serial number 412446, engines pulled, skin peeled back to expose buckled longerons. The assessment is clean. Strike it from the roster. Cannibalize what's useful, bulldoze the rest off the hard stand. In a theater swimming in spare parts, this would be routine. But in early 1942 New Guinea, where the 19th Bomb Group can count flyable fortresses on 2 hands, scrapping a fuselage, still mostly intact, feels like amputating a healthy limb. Staff Sergeant Tom Bridges' crew chief, flight engineer, and the closest thing 41-2446 has to an advocate, makes his case in the operations tent that evening. The forward fuselage is sound. 3 engines are rebuildable. Flight controls, oxygen trunks, electrical buses, all salvageable if they can source a tail section. He knows where to find one. A B-17D, written off 2 months earlier after a prop strike in Townsville, sits in the boneyard with a perfect empennage and an unsalvageable wing spar. Doctrine says you don't marry airframes in the field. Wright-Patterson engineers spend months validating structural loads before authorizing modifications. Bridges says they can do it in a week. Command gives him 4 days. The work begins at first light. A truck convoy hauls the donor tail section north from Townsville on this single-lane coastal track, arriving after dark coated in red dust. By lamplight, riggers unbolt the original tail cone from 41-2446 and maneuver the replacement into position, aligning bolt holes that were drilled on a factory jig 8,000 miles away and now must mate on uneven Australian coral. The fit is close but not exact. Shims are cut from scrap aluminum and hammered into the gaps. Longerons are spliced and reinforced with fish plates. Safety wire, miles of it, cinches every fastener that can't be torqued to spec because the torque wrenches are somewhere on a supply ship still weeks out. Control linkages are the nightmare. Elevator cables must be rerouted through pulleys that don't quite align, tensioned by hand and lock-wired because the tension meters are back in California. Bridges and his crew rig a field test, one man in the cockpit cycling the yoke, while another lies in the tail cone watching the elevator horn for binding or slack. They adjust, re-rig, adjust again. It takes 2 nights. Oxygen lines and electrical harnesses are spliced where the fuselages join, each connection wrapped in friction tape and logged on a hand-drawn schematic because the official wiring diagrams don't account for a hybrid airframe. Bridges pressurizes the oxygen system at dusk, walking the length of the fuselage with a soap bottle, hunting for bubbles that betray a leak. He finds 3 and seals them with spare compression fittings scavenged from the boneyard. The system holds at 300 psi. It's not perfect, it's flyable. On the 4th morning, Bridges signs the Form 1A in pencil, accepted for test flight, and climbs aboard for a dawn hop over the Coral Sea. The bomber handles heavy, the spliced tail adding drag the trim tabs barely counter, but the engines pull clean, and the oxygen flows and the electrical buses don't spark. He lands, makes notes, tightens 6 more safety wire clusters, and tells the operations officer they're mission ready. 24 hours later, Command assigns the patched fortress to a strike on Lae, a Japanese-held airfield on the northern coast of New Guinea. 8-hour round trip, no escort, crew briefing at 0400. Bridges loads his tool roll with the inventory of scarcity, spare clamps, a roll of muslin speed tape, safety wire, a compression sleeve left over from the oxygen repairs, and a pair of vice grips that have already outlasted 3 aircraft. He stows the roll beneath the flight engineer station in the cockpit, within arm's reach of the instrument panel, and runs his pre-flight walk-around in the dark. Every panel he touches, every fastener he checks, he installed himself. He knows the airframe not as a factory blueprint, but as a living ledger of compromise, abundant skill stretched across scarce metal. Engines start at 0515. Mixture rich, throttles forward. The bomber taxis toward the coral strip as the horizon bleeds pink over the Coral Sea. Bridges stands between the pilots, Eyes on the manifold pressure gauges. Number 3 engine runs hot. It always has since the rebuild, but it pulls rated power and the cylinder head temps stay below redline. At rotation speed, the tail, someone else's tail, lifts smoothly, and the fortress claws into the humid air. Climb out is by the manual, the only part of the mission that still is. Cowl flaps open to cool the climb, mixture leaned as altitude builds, turbo wastegates cracked at 10,000 feet to feed the superchargers. Bridges watches fuel flow and calls tank transfers over interphones so the wings stay balanced. At 15,000 feet, he checks oxygen flow at every crew station, then pulls his mask tight and moves aft to verify the system one more time. The spliced lines hum faintly under pressure, a sound he has learned to distinguish from the roar of slipstream and engines. Everything holds. They cross the New Guinea coast at 20,000 feet, the green ridges below stitched with cloud. The pilot calls flak ahead, and seconds later the first bursts ink the sky to port, black puffs blossoming at altitude, Japanese gunners bracketing the formation. A close burst rattles the fuselage. He feels it through the deck, a shiver that says metal has been touched. Then he hears it, a high, thin hiss from the waist section, unmistakable even over engine noise. Oxygen leak. He's already moving, crouched low, tool roll in hand. The leak is where he feared it would be, at a spliced junction 10 feet aft of the radio room, where the borrowed tail meets the original fuselage. The compression fitting has cracked under vibration, and pure O2 streams into the 30 below air, an invisible hemorrhage that will drain the system in minutes and leave the crew hypoxic before they reach the target. Bridges pulls the vice grips and the spare clamp from his roll. The fitting is frozen, metal contracted in the cold, and his hands are clumsy in fleece gloves. He strips the gloves, grips barehanded, and feels skin stick to metal. He loosens the old clamp, slides the spare over the line, and tightens it down with the vice grips until the hiss fades to nothing. Muslin tape follows, layer after layer. A wrap job that would fail any depot inspection but swallows the last whisper of the leak. He flexes his fingers, white and numb, and pulls the gloves back on. The interphone crackles. Fighters, 12 o'clock high. Bridges snaps his head forward. Through the waist windows he sees them, 3 Mitsubishi Zeros peeling out of the sun, dark silhouettes growing fast. The top turret is empty. He scrambles forward past the bomb bay and hauls himself into the seat. The twin 50s swing under his hands, charging handles already back. The lead Zero grows in the glass, nose winking with machine gun fire. Bridges tracks and fires. The guns hammer, shell casings raining onto the cockpit deck. The Japanese pilots who intercepted B-17s over the Southwest Pacific in 1942 did not lack courage or skill. They lacked the weapons to kill quickly what they hit repeatedly. Saburo Sakai, the Imperial Navy's ace, who would survive the war with 64 confirmed victories, described the Flying Fortress in his memoir with a mixture of respect and frustration. The Zero's 7.7mm and 20mm cannon could shred aluminum and wound men, but against a target as large and redundant as a B-17, they rarely delivered the catastrophic structural failure that ends a fight in seconds. Sakai wrote of fortresses trailing smoke, streaming fuel, engines feathered, yet still holding formation and clawing toward home. Other pilots echoed the sentiment. The American heavy bomber was a porcupine, bleeding but refusing to fall, its guns tracking even as pieces tore away. From the cockpit of a Zero, closing at combined speeds that left seconds to aim, the B-17 seemed less a machine than a phenomenon, something engineered to endure beyond reason. What those pilots could not see, because it happened inside the aluminum skin and behind the gunfire, was the human effort that kept the phenomenon alive. The endurance was not automatic. It was willed into being, one repair at a time, by men who understood that the machine's tolerances were only as wide as their ability to stretch them. And that effort began long before the first engine turned over for a mission. The night before a dawn sortie, the flight line at Port Moresby or Townsville became a dim sprawl of work, lit by shielded lanterns and flashlights, taped to emit only a slit of beam. Ground crews moved between aircraft like surgeons between patients, diagnosing, cutting, grafting. A B-17 that had aborted the previous day with a failed hydraulic pump became a donor. The pump was unbolted, cleaned, bench-tested, and installed in another airframe by midnight. Oxygen hoses cracked by tropical sun were trimmed, spliced, and pressure-checked. Fabric engine cowlings, shredded by flak or fatigue, were hand-stitched with sail thread because replacement panels would not arrive for weeks. The work was methodical but never routine. Every decision carried weight. Cannibalize this hydraulic line to fix that brake assembly? Pull this generator to restore electrical power to another aircraft? The math was brutal. Sacrifice one to save one, and hope the supply ship arrives before you run out of things to sacrifice. Crew chiefs logged the swaps in pencil on grease-stained forms, creating maintenance genealogies where a single fortress might carry parts from 4 different airframes, each component a small bet that tonight's improvisation would hold through tomorrow's combat. By 0400, engines coughed to life. The patched bomber, tail grafted, oxygen spliced, systems jury-rigged and signed off, taxied toward the duty it was rebuilt to perform. The ground crew stood in the dark and watched it go, knowing they would do it all again the next night if it came back, or strip it for parts if it didn't. The return leg begins clean. Bombs away overlay, the formation wheels south, trading the flak for the relative mercy of open sky. Altitude holds at 20,000 feet. Fuel burn is on profile. The oxygen system, patched once already, flows steady. For 10 minutes, the mission looks like it might end without further drama. Then the tail starts to shimmy. It's subtle at first, a low-frequency vibration that Bridges feels through the deck plating before he sees it in the elevator cables. The grafted tail section, stressed by turbulence and the earlier flak hit, is flexing at the splice joint. The elevator response lags, mushier than it should be, and the pilot's voice crackles over interphone. Trims off, feels like tail flutter. Bridges moves aft, steadying himself on the catwalk as the bomber bucks through rough air. In the tail cone, he finds the problem. One of the elevator control cables has jumped its pulley guide, slackening the linkage just enough to introduce play into the control circuit. He pulls the cable back into the groove by hand, holds it there, and secures it with the twist of safety wire looped through the pulley housing. It's a field fix that would make a tech inspector wince, but the shimmy dampens, and the pilot reports improved feel. "Good," the co-pilot says. "Now figure out why we're flying left wing low. Fuel imbalance. The Tokyo tanks in the wings should feed evenly, but one of the transfer valves, original equipment not scavenged, is sticking, leaving the left wing heavier by 200 pounds. Bridges returns to the cockpit, eyes on the fuel panel, and manually transfers fuel from the left main to the right, coaxing the wings back into balance. It takes 3 transfer cycles and constant monitoring because the sticky valve means the imbalance will creep back if he stops paying attention. Then the number 2 turbo starts to overboost. Manifold pressure spikes on the gauge, the engine note climbing toward the ragged edge of detonation. Bridges pulls the turbo control, but the wastegate cable, another hand-rigged component, binds and won't retard smoothly. He has seconds before the engine grenades itself. He reaches into the crawl space behind the instrument panel, finds the cable, and works it free from the snag with his fingers, feeling the resistance give. The manifold pressure drops back into the green. His hands are shaking. No time to steady them. The interphone barks. Fighters, 7 o'clock high. 2 zeros, diving out of a cloud gap. Tracers already stitching the air. Bridges hauls himself into the top turret, swings the guns aft, and tracks the lead fighter through the sight. The zero grows, wings sparkling with muzzle flash. Bridges fires, a long rattling burst, and the fighter breaks hard left, either hit or evading, impossible to tell in the seconds before it vanishes beneath the fuselage. He doesn't wait to confirm. The oxygen system is hissing again, a new leak somewhere forward, and he's out of the turret and crawling toward the sound before the second zero completes its pass. He finds the leak at a junction near the bombardier station, tightens the compression fitting with the vice grips, wraps it with the last of his muslin tape, and checks the pressure gauge, still holding, barely. Back to the turret. The Zeros circle, probing for an opening, but they don't press another attack, fuel or ammunition running low, or simply unwilling to trade their lives for a single crippled bomber that refuses to go down. They peel away to the north, and the formation flies on, alone again above the Coral Sea. Bridges realizes they're heavy, too heavy. The fuel burn should have them lighter by now, but the airspeed is sluggish and the engines are laboring. He does the math. The bomb load is gone, but they're still carrying full defensive ammunition, armor plates stowed behind the waist guns, and a spare oxygen bottle that hasn't been needed. Dead weight. He makes the call. The armor plates go first, manhandled to the waist hatch and shoved out into the slipstream. The spare bottle follows. Tools he won't need for the remaining 2 hours. Wrenches, a spare compression fitting, a coil of wire, everything not essential. The bomber lightens. The airspeed creeps up, and the fuel flow drops just enough to matter. It's not one fix, it's a dozen, layered and interlocking, each small adjustment buying minutes that accumulate into survival. Hand trim the elevator, transfer fuel to balance the wings, nurse the turbo, patch the oxygen, shed the weight, fire the guns when the enemy closes, then start again. Because nothing stays fixed, and the fight home is never gust distance, it's endurance measured in the things you notice before they fail, and the things you jury-rig before they kill you. The Australian coast appears as a dark smudge on the horizon, then sharpens into ridges and the white thread of surf. Altitude bleeds off, the formation descends, and Port Moresby Strip resolves from the haze. A ribbon of coral carved into the kunai grass, a few tents, a handful of watchers on the ground. They see the fortress before they hear it, a ragged silhouette, trailing a thin streamer of oil smoke, one engine feathered, the others pulling just enough power to hold altitude. The wheels creak down, hydraulics groaning, and the bomber settles into the pattern. No drama in the approach, no last-minute crisis, just a heavy aircraft at the edge of its tolerances, held together by engineering, bent to the limits of what's permissible, and by a mechanic who knew exactly how far he could bend it. The wheels kiss coral, the tail drops, the bomber rolls out, brakes squealing, and turns off the active runway under its own power. Mission complete. When Bridges climbs down onto the hardstand, he doesn't look triumphant, he looks tired. His hands are raw, his flight suit is stained with hydraulic fluid and oil, and his tool roll is lighter by half the inventory he carried at takeoff. But the aircraft is intact, the crew is alive, and the bomber will fly again because scarcity demanded it, and abundance, the kind that matters, came not from a depot, but from the man who knew what to do when the depot was 7,000 miles away, and the manual ran out of answers. The oxygen line, the tail swap, the mechanic who doubles as gunner. Before we go further, it's worth pausing to show the receipts. This is cinematic micro-history, not historical fiction, and every beat we reconstruct rests on a documentary foundation. Some details are exact, others are composites drawn from multiple sources. Here's what we can prove, where the evidence lives, and how we'll show it on screen. Start with the tail section swap, the most dramatic example of field cannibalization, and the hardest to believe if you haven't seen the documentation. The proof survives in aluminum and archival record. B-17D serial number 403097, known as the Swoos, flew with the 19th Bomb Group through the chaotic first months of the Pacific War, and became the unit's most famous survivor. She is preserved today at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and her restoration fact sheet, available in the museum's archives and published online, confirms what maintenance logs recorded in 1942. The tail section she wears is not original. It was grafted on in the field from another aircraft, a wartime modification born of necessity and executed with hand tools on a distant airstrip. Restoration photographs show the splice joint, the reinforcement fish plates, and the rivet patterns that don't quite match factory standard. When we depict a crew chief arguing to save a battered airframe by marrying it to a salvaged tail, we are not inventing drama. We are showing what the Swoos proves was possible and necessary. For the broader context of scarcity, cannibalization, and the brutal operational tempo, we turn to the 19th Bomb Group's war diaries and unit histories, archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base. These records detailed the long overwater sorties to Rabaul and Lai, the chronic parts shortages, the reliance on hangar queens stripped to keep other aircraft flying, and the improvised maintenance culture that emerged when supply lines stretched across the Pacific couldn't keep pace with combat attrition. Mission logs note aircraft status, abort rates due to mechanical failure, and the steady decline in serviceable bombers through early 1942, context that grounds our narrative in the material realities these crews faced. The technical backbone, how a flight engineer managed systems, what emergency procedures governed oxygen leaks or turbo malfunctions, and the step-by-step sequences we visualize in the cockpit comes directly from the Army Air Force's Pilot and Flight Engineer Training Manual for the B-17, specifically the AAF Manual 51-127 series published during the war. When we show mixture settings, turbo wastegate adjustments, fuel transfer sequences, or oxygen system pressure checks, we overlay the relevant checklist page or schematic from the period manual. The flight engineer's dual role as systems manager and top turret gunner is likewise documented in crew position descriptions and training syllabi. It was unofficial doctrine, born of crew shortages, but it was widespread enough to appear in mission reports and oral histories. For the enemy perspective, how Japanese pilots engaged the fortress and perceived its durability, we cite Saburo Sakai's memoir, Samurai, and cross-reference it with John Lundstrom's The First Team, the definitive operational history of Pacific Naval Air Combat in 1942. These sources characterize engagement patterns, the difficulty of downing a B-17, and the tactics Zero pilots employed during high-altitude intercepts. Details are illustrative rather than tied to a single tail number or sortie. We are reconstructing the texture of these encounters, not claiming a specific dogfight with a named ace unless the mission report supports it. The in-flight repair sequences, oxygen line clamps, safety wire fixes, field expedients executed under fire, draw on comparative evidence from the European theater, where better documented missions offer granular detail. We reference 303rd Bomb Group mission reports filed in the Hell's Angels collection, and Roger A. Freeman's The Mighty Eighth, which catalogs emergency repairs, battle damage, and the improvisations crews employed to stay aloft. These are flagged on screen as comparative analogs, not Southwest Pacific originals, but they illuminate what was technically feasible and how mechanics solved problems that the manuals never anticipated. The principles of physics, metallurgy, and desperation don't change between theaters. We also flag what we avoid. Contested myths, parachute shroud lines allegedly holding fuselage sections together, entire tail assemblies attached by a thread, gunners firing until their barrels melted, are dramatic but often exaggerated or debunked by engineering analysis. When a detail sounds too cinematic to be true, we either find primary source confirmation or we don't use it. The goal is not to sanitize the story, but to anchor it in what actually happened, which is compelling enough without embellishment. Visually, every technical overlay, every map, every altitude or coordinate we display is sourced. If we show a route over the Coral Sea, the waypoints come from published mission logs. If we visualize a turbo control linkage or an oxygen manifold, the diagram is pulled from the tech order or restoration archive. If we composite a sequence from multiple documented repairs, we note it on screen so the audience knows where specificity ends and synthesis begins. This transparency is not a hedge, it's a promise. You're watching a reconstruction built from training manuals, war diaries, museum archives, and the memoirs of men who flew and fought. Where the record is silent, we say so. Where it speaks, we listen and we show you the page. Now, with the evidence on the table, we return to the mission and the moment when all the improvisation, all the scavenged parts, all the safety wire and skill face their hardest test. The patched fortress touches down at Port Moresby 8 hours and 14 minutes after takeoff. Number 3 engine trailing oil, the oxygen system holding at reduced pressure, and every man aboard still breathing. The landing is smooth. The debrief is not. Intelligence officers want bomb damage assessment and fighter counts. The pilot logs mechanical discrepancies, overboost on 3, oil pressure drop on 2, persistent vibration in the tail assembly, and notes that the aircraft returned mission-capable only because the flight engineer executed 2 in-flight repairs under combat conditions. The maintenance officer inspects the fuselage, finds the spliced oxygen line still wrapped in muslin tape and safety wire, and shakes his head. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. Staff Sergeant Bridges doesn't wait for the paperwork. He's already back on the hard stand with a flashlight, tracing the oxygen trunk for fatigue cracks, checking control cable tension in the grafted tail, running his hands over skin panels dimpled by flak fragments. The bomber is flyable, barely, but it will need a full post-flight, new compression fittings for the O2 system, and another round of safety wiring before the next sortie. There's no stand-down. The mission board already lists another strike for tomorrow. 3 days later, Bridges receives a promotion to technical sergeant. No ceremony, just a set of stripes and a handshake from the squadron CO. The citation, if one was written, does not survive in the archives. What does survive is the aircraft. Serial 412446 flies 18 more missions before rotating stateside in late 1942. Her hybrid airframe a testament not to engineering elegance, but to the brutal pragmatism that kept the 19th Bomb Group in the fight when doctrine said they should have been grounded. The most famous survivor of that era, B-17D, serial 43097, the Swoos, never saw combat again after her return to the United States, but she became something more valuable than another set of wings over the Pacific. She became proof that airframes could be grafted in the field, that mechanics could outthink the manual, that scarcity could birth a kind of abundance measured not in spare parts, but in the skill to make do without them. Restored and preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the Swoos still wears her mismatched tail section, the rivet lines and fish plates visible to anyone who looks closely. She is a monument not to the machine as designed, but to the machine as reimagined by men who had no choice but to make it work. And that distinction matters because it resolves the tensions woven through this story. Doctrine versus improvisation is often framed as a binary. Either you follow the manual or you don't. But the mechanics of the 19th Bomb Group and later the 8th Air Force over Europe proved that doctrine needs improvisers to survive first contact with reality. The technical orders written at Wright Field assumed a logistics pipeline that didn't exist in New Guinea in 1942 and frequently broke down over England in 1944. The engineers who wrote those manuals were not wrong. They simply could not anticipate every variable of distance, weather, and enemy action. The flight engineers and crew chiefs who bent the rules didn't discard the doctrine. They extended it, grafting field expedients onto factory blueprints and proving that the system was resilient enough to tolerate creative interpretation when lives depended on it. Machine versus man is likewise a false divide. The Flying Fortress earned its legend for durability, for absorbing punishment and bringing crews home. But the durability was never purely structural. It was human. Every oxygen line patched under fire, every turbo cable reseated by feel in a freezing crawl space, every engine nurse through overboost or oil starvation. These were acts of human agency that transformed engineered tolerances into survival margins. The machine could endure, the man made it so. And scarcity versus abundance reveals the deeper paradox of industrial warfare. The United States in World War II is remembered for material abundance, factories that outproduced the Axis, supply chains that stretched across oceans, depots stacked with spare parts. That abundance was real, but it was unevenly distributed and often arrived too late. In the forward theaters, scarcity was the constant, and abundance had to be improvised. One mechanic's skill multiplied across a dozen repairs, one salvaged tail section keeping 2 airframes flying, one roll of safety wire holding together a system that peacetime engineering would have condemned. Tactical ingenuity at the crew level became strategic endurance at the theater level because empowered maintainers trusted to bend the book without breaking the airframe, kept the bombers aloft when the supply chain could not. The lesson outlasted the war. Modern aerospace maintenance still walks the line between procedure and adaptation, checklist and judgment. The mechanics who keep aircraft flying today inherit a tradition forged in coral dust and cold European skies, where the manual was a starting point, not a limit, and where survival often hinged on a sergeant with pliers and the nerve to trust his own hands.